Mitzvot Hashem, next week, Be'ez Hashem, with God's help, next week, on Zion Adar, Tuesday, will be the chasana, the wedding of my dear son, Yeshua. So to say a few words about the month of Adar, and connect it specifically to the idea of a chasana, to a wedding. So the Mishnah, in the beginning of Shekalim, the Mishnah says that be'echad ba'adar mashmim ala Shekalim v'ala Kilayim. That on the first day of Adar, the first day of the month of Adar, there's a proclamation that goes out telling people about the mitzvah, to remind people about the mitzvah of giving Shekalim, which is a half a shekel. The mitzvah is that every single person has to give a kofer nafshe, has to give an atonement for their soul. And how much does a person have to give? A person have to give a chatzi shekel, a half a shekel. And also, the Mishnah says that we also call out and we proclaim publicly about the mitzvah of Kilayim. Kilayim is a major trope in the Torah, a major theme of the Torah, which the Torah is, and Kilayim means the idea of not mixing things. Certain elements are not meant to be mixed. For example, there's Kilayim in begadim, there's Kilayim in, let's say, garments, that we don't mix wool and linen. In the Torah, generally wool and linen are considered the proper levush, a proper garment. Everything else is considered like a secondary garment. And the Torah says we're not allowed to mix wool and linen together, not in the same garments. Or there's Kilay Akerem, there's Kilay Yizroim, there's the idea of you can't mix vegetation, you can't mix vegetation with, you can't graft vegetation with a vineyard. There's also the idea of Kilayim, the concept of Kilayim in even with animals, to crossbreed, we're not allowed to crossbreed animals, etc., things like that. Which means that everything has to stay in its proper place. So these are two things that we call out, that are called out publicly in the month of Adar. And then the Mishnah continues, and then on the 15th day is the day that in the Krachim, the big cities, the walled cities, that's the day that they read the Megillah. So to understand a little bit, what is the connection between, if there is any, and of course it can be just coincidentally, and it has to do with halachic ramifications, because that's when you bring the shekalim, you take the half shekel, and then we bring the offerings of the coming year. The new year starts, for the offering starts from Baltachar, starts from Nisan, so it has to do with that, and bringing public offerings. So we could read it as a very technical thing, but then we could read a little bit deeper. Everything is b'hashgacha, everything is by divine providence, certainly things that are written about in the Torah. So what is the connection between Shekalim and Kilayim? The idea of chatzi shekel and the idea of Kilayim. Now we also know that Shekalim is very much connected, the idea of bringing a half a shekel is also connected with the story of Purim. The Gemara says, in Megillah, the Gemara says, Hikdam HaKadosh Baruch es Shekalim l'shkalav shel Haman. That Hashem says that in the story of the Megillah, Haman once gives a certain amount of money to Achashverosh, the metaphor of a tail and charitz, and so wants to get rid of his mountain, so wants to get rid of his hole. And he gives him a certain amount of shekalim. And then HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, Hashem says that the mitzvah of shekalim, which happens in the beginning of Adar, precedes and therefore annuls the shekalim, those coins that were given from Haman. Therefore, the decree of Haman was nullified. So let's try to understand the theme between all these ideas, and particularly how it's maybe connected to a chassan, to a bride and to a groom on the day of their marriage, or connected to the marriage. So the Gemara, there's no Bavli, there's no Babylonian Talmud on Shekalim, but there is Yerushalmi. And the Yerushalmi, the Jerusalem Talmud, speaks about the idea of Shekalim. That's a guy Shekalim speaks about. And in there, in chapter 3, part 3, the Gemara says like this, that when it talks about what's the reason for a chatzi shekel, the Torah doesn't say anything why we have to give a chatzi shekel, why do we have to give a half of this coin. It only says that we have to give a chatzi shekel. No one can give more, no one can give less. Every person equally has to give only a half a shekel. Of course, the idea of a chatzi means that there's a half, and then with another person that becomes a whole. Someone can give for another person a chatzi shekel, but every person only has to give and can only give a chatzi shekel, not more, not less. Sometimes needlessly, but sometimes for the building of the Mishkan, it could be a person give as much as they want, as much as they desire. Mar b'maholaviyah, people gave a tremendous amount. But with regards to chatzi shekel, the mitzvah of a kofer nafshe for the atonement of the soul, a person can only bring a half a shekel. So why a half a shekel? So Rebbe says in the name, or Levi says in the name of Rish Lakish, he says like this, that the reason for the half a shekel is going to be related to the sale of Yosef. We know the story in the Torah, where the 10 brothers, sell their younger brother, Reuven also included, 10 brothers sell the younger brother, which is the younger brother Yosef, which is the son of Rachel. So the Torah, there is another mitzvah is connected to money, to coins, which is the 5 slime, that when a person has a pidyon haben, which means when there's a first child that's born to a mother, that the first child that's born in a natural way through the womb, that this child, if it's Yisrael, this child has to have a pidyon haben. What is a pidyon haben? A pidyon haben is the redemption of the child, which means you exchange, so to speak, this first child, who theoretically could be a bechor, and in times before the chet, before the story of the chet ha'egel, the story of the golden calf, the bechorim, Kaddish called bechor, that the bechor was sacred, that the firstborn had a certain sacred task. So today already, in times from that time forward, it was with the kohen. So what a person has to do is they have to do pidyon haben. They redeem their child, and they give the kohen, in exchange, they give the kohen 5 slime, which is 20 kesef, the amount of 20 kesef. That's the measurement. So the Reb Shimon Lakish says like this: since the sale of Yosef was for esrim kesef, for 20 kesef, so therefore you call echa ve'echa poides b'noi b'choyer b'esrim kesef. Therefore, every person should redeem their child with 20 kesef, which is 5 slime. Okay, so that's the idea. A pidyon haben is connected to the sale of Yosef. The total amount of the sale of Yosef was 20 kesef. So therefore, for the redemption of a child, a person should give the kohen 20 kesef. Since they sold the bechor of Rachel, the firstborn of Rachel, which is Yosef, they sold him for 20 kesef. And each one, in other words, 20 kesef, which means each one got 2 kesef, which is a chatzi shekel. The amount of 2 kesef is this 4 kesef in a shekel. So they got, each individual person got 2 kesef. 20 divided into 10 is 2 each, which is a half a shekel. So therefore, a person should give, each person should give a half a shekel. So we see there are 2 things what the Yerushalmi is saying. 2 mitzvahs arise as perhaps a tikkun, a type of correction to the sale of Yosef and his brother, the sale of Yosef by his brothers. One is the idea of pidyon haben, the redemption of the first child, which seems, the redemption of this first child seems to be a positive thing. There's nothing negative in that transaction. There's no kofer nafshe, there's no atonement for any negativity. It's the firstborn child is redeemed with these 5 kesef, with these 20 kesef, which is the amount of the total sale of Yosef. So therefore we redeem our child. That's like bechor was sold. The bechor of Rachel was sold for 20 kesef. Therefore we redeem our firstborn child, with 20 kesef. And then the second thing is how much they each received. Each of the shvatim, each of the tribes of the brothers of Yosef received 2 kesef, which is a chatzi shekel. So therefore we do kofer nafshe. But these seem to be 2 opposite ideas almost, because Pidyon ben is just a positive thing. There's nothing negative. There's no ramifications. There's no intimations of anything negative. Koifer nafshi, atonement for the soul, means there's something wrong, and that would make sense. Each of the brothers received a chatzi shekel, a half a shekel. So for an atonement for that sale, connected to Bechor, connected to atonement, each person has to bring a chatzi shekel. Okay, that's for atonement. But the first part is not an atonement. So how could one mitzvah be connected to these two? How could one transaction be connected to these two mitzvahs? And these two mitzvahs seem to be opposite from each other. Let's go to the idea of a chassan for a moment. The Yerushalmi, Rashi brings us down also, it's a medrash, that at certain times the Chazal tell us, sages tell us, that when something happens to a person, sometimes a person's previous sins are forgiven. For example, one of the things that are given is chassan, that a bride and a groom, chassan and kala, that the bride is, we forgive, there's a mechila, there's a forgiveness of all the sins that a person does, all the transgressions a person does up until that point. When a person gets married, everything that was done negative previously, up until that point, is forgiven. But the question is, why? What's exactly happens when a person becomes married? What's the magic, so to speak, that all of a sudden a person becomes married, and because of the marriage, there's like a sweeping forgiveness for everything that was done? What actually happens, and why is that so? So, to understand this, we have to understand a little bit what it is to be what it means to be single, and what it means to be in a relationship in a holy covenant of marriage, in a bris nisuin. And the question is a person whole before they get married, and there's some type of a higher level of completion when a person is married, or is a person half? This is kind of an interesting way of thinking about this. But in the Rishonim, in the Kadmonim, in the early Rishonim, you find this idea of a chatzi and a shalom, or chatzi kader, a half a circle and a full circle. For example, it's not exactly in the same context. There's a sefer that's printed recently. There's a book that's printed recently from a manuscript by Rabbeinu Yoel. Rabbeinu Yoel is one of the earlier Rishonim from the Chassidi Ashkenaz, part of that school, in the 1200s in the Rhineland, in Germany. Rabbeinu Yoel seems to be a student, I'm not 100% sure, but he seems to be a student of Reb Shmuel HaChassid, who is the father of one of the most famous Chassidi Ashkenaz, which is Rabbi Yehuda HaChassid, the author or the compiler or the one that's connected to Sefer Chassidim. Sefer Chassidim itself is not actually a sefer, a book, but it's a book that was evolved over many years and a collection of many ideas. But Rabbi Yehuda HaChassid is connected to Sefer Chassidim for sure. So this Rabbeinu Yoel, so this a week ago, Rabbeinu Yoel writes that he's talking about in the book of Shmois, he talks about the idea of Shabbos, and he says that when it says in Chazal, the Gemara that the Gemara says that a person has an neshama yisera on Shabbos, that a person has an extra soul, he says like this, that the soul is divided, chatzi neshama, chatzi. A person has a half a neshama, half a soul during the week, a chatzi neshama, another half a soul on Shabbos, and on Shabbos, the souls become together, therefore the soul becomes complete. But what does it actually mean that a person has a half a soul? What does it mean that a person has a half a soul? The earliest book written as a book, so to speak, outside or after post the Gemara, one of the earliest, and the earliest book written in terms of Jewish hashkafa, philosophy. And this is a monumental work because it ushered in a new era of Jewish literature, of Torah literature, the Messiah, is a sefer by Reb Sadia Gaon. Sadia Gaon was the great 10th century Gaon, the head of the yeshiva in Surah, is an Egyptian scholar, a tremendous Egyptian scholar. That became the Gaon, became the Rosh Yeshiva in Bavel, in Babylonia. And Reb Sadia Gaon wrote a sefer, which is what he's mainly known for, at least today. Reb Sadia wrote on everything. He wrote on grammar. He wrote on Shas. He wrote Paskim, and he wrote a Pirush al Torah. He wrote many, many things, and a lot of literature was written against the crime. But Reb Sadi Gaon, this great genius, wrote a sefer called, a great tzaddik, called Emunah V'Deis. And in Emunah V'Deis, translated as faith and opinions, he speaks about this concept that some people say, and he's talking about the crime, if you're familiar, that some people say that before a person is married, they only have a chatzi kader, they have a half a soul, or half a circle. They're not a kader shalom, not a complete sphere. And Reb Sadi says, Reb Sadi Gaon writes, that this is not true. That it's not true. That's not true that a person is only a half a circle, a half a sphere before they're married. And married completes their sphere, completes their wholeness. But every person has a neshama. Doesn't use exactly the word neshama, but every person has a soul. And that soul, their beingness, their spirituality, their tzura, however the Rishonim speak about this, is something that's complete. They have a wholeness already within themselves. It's not a chatzi kader, it's a kader shalom. It's not a half a sphere, it's a full sphere. Now we also know that the Zohar HaKadosh, which was only revealed much later, a few hundred years later after Reb Sadi Gaon, almost 300 years later, Reb Sadi, the Zohar speaks about a palga de gufa. The Zohar clearly speaks about that before a person's married, a person is only a half a body. Palga, a half. It's Aramaic for half, like a chatzi, a palga de gufa. There's a palga de nishmasa, also speaks about, later Kabbalah explained this idea that there's a palga de nishmasa, like a half a soul. And in marriage, through marriage, a person becomes a complete soul, a complete body, and a complete soul. This is why the Ari HaKadosh writes, the Arizal says that a person, you could say, Al brischach samtim serenu, even when a person benches, or when a woman says benching, Birchas Hamazon, you can say Al brischach samtim serenu, even though a woman doesn't have a bris, even though the Gemara says there's two opinions about this, but it's more because it's one body. There's one body, a man and his wife, a wife and his husband and wife, a wife and a husband, is a full body and a full soul. And before even they're married, they're each one half, and then when they find each other, they're complete and they become full. So which one is it? Is it whole or is it half? I mean, this is obviously, we could say it's just a machlokes, it's just an argument, but on a deeper level, there's not a machlokes, there's not an argument, but they're actually talking about two different things. And the answer to this question, whether a person's half or whole, is really to distinguish between the prat and the klal, between a person's perspective of self as an individual versus a person's perspective of himself or herself within the collective. There's a dimension within us, in the world of the prat, in the world of the individual, of the specific, that we're complete. Every single soul is complete. Every single person is complete. And there's a certain level, certain measure of completion, of wholeness that a person has within themselves, even without living with a spouse, without being married. And then there's another dimension of self in comparison to the klal, to the collective, where a person is just, or not just, is a half that is seeking to become more whole when they enter into marriage. So each soul, each individual person has a particular shlichus, a particular soul journey, a soul signature of what their purpose of this world is. They have their own distinct light and their own distinct way of being in this world, just like every single individual has their own DNA and their own specific way on a physical level of how they look and appear and present themselves. Of course, this is an expression of their spiritual constitution, which is very unique and specific. And in that sense, there's actually zero chesed, there's zero absence in our consciousness from the level of our specific of our soul. Every person is an olam katan. Every person is a complete world, a complete microcosm of the entire world. This is with regards to the prat. Every person in their individual prat, in their specific, they're completely whole. So that's the wholeness of the prat, of the specific. But then in relationship to the klal, in relationships to Knesset Yisrael, to the collective, then each person can view themselves as a chelik, as a part, as a chatzi, as as an aver, like one of the ivarei Ashchina, one of the ivarim of the guf. That's the Yerushalmi also speaks about this in terms of not to take revenge. That you're taking revenge, it's like the right hand taking revenge with the left hand. We're all part of one God, one body. All the neshamas, all the souls. The Gemara says that there's a oitzer, there's a source. Tosfos says there's an oitzer that's called gufim. That the oitzer neshama is called gufim, which means guf means a gevia achas, one being, one body, which means in the world of the specifics, when we're looking at the prat, when we're looking at the individual is completely whole in himself and herself, and there's a sense of wholeness because a person is not just a chatzi, but a kadosh shalom, a complete sphere. But in comparison and in relationship, because there are two dimensions of self, there's a part of self which is the individual self, and then there's a part of self which is the social part of self, the social animal, which is, or the relationship being, which is our relationship to others. So in relationship to self, we're complete. In relationship to others, in relationship to Knesset Yisrael, to the collective of Kelal Yisrael, then we can look at ourselves as only a chatzi, only a half that needs to become whole through being with others. So on the level of prat, let's understand this in terms of forgiveness. On the level of prat, in specific, as individuals, we're always judged. Every person is ish b'chet yomas. Every person is judged according to their own actions. And when the Torah speaks about a person being judged because of the actions of their ancestors, that's because if they're oisav ma'asav oisav, I mean, if they continue those actions, they don't break those patterns. There are certain patterns that we inherit even from our ancestors, from our parents, but we have choice whether to turn on these markers or to turn off these markers or continue to keep those markers on, even if it's part of our DNA. If we're born and a person's born in a more hostile environment and they have certain reactions, but a person still has free choice, and the free choice that's why a person is judged as an individual. So therefore, there's schos, there's merit, and there could be the opposite of merit, and there could be purity, and it could be the opposite, it could be blemish. That's in the world of the prat. So we're whole, we're complete, and we're judged as individuals. But the Kelal, the collective of Kelal Yisrael, the collective of the people of Israel, the collective of Kelal Yisrael, with regards to the Kelal Yisrael, when we're talking about the specifics of the individual, then, some people are tzaddikim, and some people maybe could be the opposite. And every person is judged according to their actions. But when we talk about the tzibur, the collective, is ein tzibur mesa. There is no death to the collective, the Gemara says, which means there is no possibility of the absence of life for the collective. For an individual, it's possible. The nitzchis of Kelal Yisrael, the eternity of Kelal Yisrael, is the nitzchis of the Kelal, is the eternity of the collective, not the eternity of the individual. The collective of Kelal Yisrael is the Eita Mesa, cannot experience death, metaphorically and literally. The collective of Nishmas Yisrael, of the collective of Kelal Yisrael, is Tuma, is not only Tchuy B'tzibur, like the Rama writes, but Tuma is also even Hutra B'tzibur. Tuma is actually allowed in the collective, because the definition of the collective is that there is no Tuma. It's not only that it's hutra, because it's not only tchuy, but it's hutra. It's allowed because there is no possibility of tum. In the place of the collective, Kelal Yisrael is always perfect. Kelal Yisrael is always the tzaddik, always the righteous. That's why a person has to be miyachad himself, unify himself, biyichud b'shem kol Yisrael. The yichud, the unification that a person has to have, is with Kelal, with the collective. When a person is Messiachet, a person that unifies himself, not only as an individual, but feels unity and feels himself as one of the avarim, one of the limbs of the collective of Kelal Yisrael, and they have love, and they have passion, and they have connection and yichud, unification with the Kelal. Then B'Shem Kol Yisrael, that a person that does a yichud with the name of Kol Yisrael, like the Rebbe writes, that the yichud with Kol Yisrael means that we're part of the collective. Part of the collective there's no tumah. In Kippur, it's important, like the Chalbana, that we have to mispal, we have to pray even with those who seem to be not absolutely righteous. The word tzibur, the word collective or gathering of the collective becomes, so the collective gathering is not just a quantity issue, that you have more people together, but it's a qualitative difference. When there's a tzibur together, it's a qualitative difference. It's a different mitzias, it's a different gather, it has a different definition. The word tzibur is an acronym for tzadikim, beinanim, which means the righteous and the intermediary people, virushoim, and also the opposite of the tzadikim, the wicked, or the opposite, the bali avera. Why? Because what does a tzibur do? Tzibur means that we become all as one. We recognize the qualitative unification of all of us as a collective. And when someone connects himself with the collective, there's no tumah, there's no impurity, there's no misa. So on the level of prat, on the level of the specifics, on the level where we're each individual, which there's a sense of wholeness within our own self, but then you're judged as an individual, and therefore in the individual there could be times that you're doing things on a very high level, a deep level, not a holy level, and sometimes, God forbid, a person could be doing the opposite. That's the level of judgment. But on the level of the klal, when a person becomes part of the klal, part of the collective, then they become part of the unfolding of the collective destiny. And the collective destiny is always perfect. The story of an individual may be sometimes, in individual states, could seem to be the opposite of the upward, forward movement, the arc of movement upwards. Even though, of course, everything is moving toward the Hagas HaYichud, the place of the unification. But in the collective, there's always, the arc of history is always moving upwards in terms of the collective. This is also when we think about marriage. And what marriage is a person grows individually, and they develop their identity and their talents and their distinctions and their uniqueness, which means their wholeness of who they are in this world. And then what is marriage? Marriage is not the eraser of the prat, the elimination of the individuality of self. It's the elevation of the prat into the klal. Is klal prat or klal prat to klal. That the Zohar says that's the highest madrega, the highest level, which is that the prat, the individual, becomes fully developed through the years until they reach the point of marriage. And then when they enter the state of marriage, the wholeness of who they are as the prat becomes part of a higher, deeper, complex, more complete relationship within the klal. This is what it means that when a person gets married, they're building a home in Klal Yisrael. They're Bayis Ne'eman B'Yisrael. They're becoming part of the nitzchis of Klal Yisrael, because God willing, they'll have children, and they're gonna build a home, and they're gonna become the marriage itself is an idea of becoming part of the klal, more than, of course, we're always part of the klal, even a person that's individual, of course, even a person that's single. But the act of marriage is a declaration, and in a way, it facilitates a deeper awareness that you're actually part of a greater Messiah, part of a greater continuity, part of a greater eternity that's unfolding. You're part of a great chain of generations. The Zohar says that under the chuppah, 3 generations of the past come. The generations of the person's past come, because that's what a chuppah is. A chuppah means that I'm continuing the tradition, the Messiah. I'm continuing to being part of this great chain of unfolding of Klal Yisrael, which is nitzchias, which is eternity. So, and this is the secret why there's mechila, why there's forgiveness when a person becomes married, because what happens when a person married is, of course, there's still the prat, but now the prat, the individual, is entering into, and in the place of the prat, that's where there's judgment against the person. But now a person enters into the klal, and there's a deeper layer of identity that's revealed, a layer where the essential connection still remains to the self, and to the selfhood of the prat still remains. But now you're living that self within a collective, which is literally what happens in a marriage. Is now your life is shared with someone else. So you don't erase the self, because that's not real true peace. But within the inclusion of self, there's an inter-inclusion of others. And so you're moving from a state of like isolated individuality into a covenant of unity. And in doing so, this is what happens. When a person does so, there is forgiveness, because they're entering into the place of the klal. And in the klal, there's always perfection. In the place of the klal, there's always perfection. Now we can understand a little bit we learned in the name of Rishon Lakish what we learned in the Yerushalmi earlier in Shekalim about these two mitzvahs from the sale of Yosef. So we say that like this, that there are two mitzvahs that emerged from the sale of Yosef. One is Pinyan Aben, which is the 20 kesef. In total, that's the 20 kesef. And one, that's a redemption of the firstborn. And one is the chatzi shekel that every single person has to bring, the half a shekel. And that's the amount that each individual of the brothers received from the sale of Yosef. So what is really lying in the depth of this teaching is that there are two things that are transpiring simultaneously. There's the collective story, which is the total sale of Yosef, which is 20 kesef, which is the amount that you have to do for Pinyan Aben, for redemption of the firstborn. And then there is the individual gain that was received by each of the brothers, which is a chatzi shekel. And that's what the Torah is telling us. That in this transaction, like any transaction, there's actually simultaneously two narratives that are occurring. There's a story which is the bigger unfolding of the story of the Kelal. The general sale of Yosef from the place of the Kelal is always perfect. Like I said, in the place of the Kelal, there's only Yediyah. From the place of the Kelal, there's always perfection. Which means from the bigger picture of the unfolding of the story, there was a plan. There's a divine plan. That Hashem sent Yosef to be, which Yosef understood later in his life, that Hashem sent Yosef to provide them in the time of famine. That doesn't negate the guilt, so to speak, on the level of the Shatim, of course, Shiftei Ka. That doesn't negate the guilt of the sale, what the brothers did. So the brothers, on the level of prat, on the level of specific, there was a type of atonement that was needed. And that's the story of the Sararugim Malchus, the tenants that would atone for them. And their Kanti writes the same numerical value as the names of the sages that were killed during the period of the Sararugim Malchus, which was not exactly in one time period, but over a period of time, the Hadrianic massacres and persecutions over a longer period of time. There was a certain atonement through them, but that's on the individual level. But then there's the collective level on the Kelal, and the Kelal, everything is already perfect. And therefore, two mitzvahs arise. From the perspective of the Kelal, from the collective, everything's already perfect. It's whole. So therefore, there's no atonement that needs to be done at that level. Again, not from the place of individual choice, because we're not talking about prat, we're talking about Kelal. We're not talking about a place where we're talking about your specific life. You're talking about the collective life. In the collective, the thing's already perfect. And the same thing also always in life. In the story of the collective, in the collective unfolding is always perfect. Individually, it could be terrible for some people, God forbid. But if you talk about the collective always is moving in the right direction, in the upwards direction, towards the place of Yichud. So in the world of the place of the collective, of the Kelal, which is the total sale of Yosef, all we need to do, not bring any kafir nafsha, there's no atonement for this level. We just say this Pinyan Aben is a positive thing. You just redeem the firstborn. When you're talking about the level of the prat, you're speaking about the individual participation in this event. That's the prat. And the level of the prat, the level is specific on the individual. Of course, it was a terrible thing. They sold a little brother into slavery. Rashbam said they didn't actually sell him to slavery, but the simple pshat, without the Rashbam, is that they sold him, or at least they wanted to sell him into slavery. So for that, there needs to be atonement. So koifer nafshay, atonement for the soul is how much? Chatzi shekel. Why chatzi shekel? Because chatzi shekel, the half a shekel, is exactly the amount of each person received. Each person received when they sold the brother of Yosef. That's the half, which is the sort of saying that's the half, that's negative half in comparison to the collective, which is whole. So, like we said before. Is a soul whole or complete? In its own life, it's whole. When you're comparing this fullness of self in relationship, the prat, in relationship to the Kelal, then it's only half. So the chatzi shekel in relationship to the 5 slime, the 20 kesef of Pinyan Aben, is only a chatzi, is only a half. And what is in order to attain atonement, what has to happen? In order to attain atonement, every person has to bring a chatzi shekel, a half, and recognize that they're not just half, they're whole. How are they whole? With another person. So the Torah is not saying you should bring a half a shekel. The Torah is saying you can only bring a half a shekel, but ultimately what the Torah wants is a full shekel. And the Torah is saying you're not full with another person. And when you're full with the other person, when your fullness in relationship to the others, which is a half, is in a relationship and becomes full with the other individual, you become part of the collective. When you're part of the collective, there's atonement for the soul. There's forgiveness. Just like a chassan when he gets married, and a kallah when they get married, a bride and groom when they get married, there's forgiveness because now they're entering their fullness of the self in relationship to the collective, in relationship to other, and when they're in relationship to other, they become part of the other. And in the world of the other, which is part of the collective, there's forgiveness. And this is also why the deeper reading of what that Mishnah means. In the beginning of Adar, Mashmim al Shekalim, of Chatzi Shekel, and also the idea of Kilayim, the idea of not mixing things, not to mix species, not to crossbreed, not to wear clothes, shatnez, all different types of things of mixing, milk and meat, etc. What is the idea of Kilayim? Kilayim is, on one hand, it's a chayk, but they're Rishonim, they're Ramban, Rabbeinu Bechaya, Tzioni, they're Kanti. Many of the Rishonim write that has to do with Kain and Hevel, like the Re speaks about the division between someone that's a farmer and someone that's a shepherd. That energetically represents different things. So what is Kilayim? What is the prohibition of Kilayim? The prohibition of Kilayim means that everything is created in limineo. Everything is created in its own way, its own distinction. Everything has its distinction. You take a barley seed, so that's unique. And then you take a vineyard and that's growing grapes and growing wine, that's unique. And everything has to be experienced in its uniqueness. We shouldn't graft things, means we should recognize the uniqueness of every single individuality. Meaning to say, to recognize the wholeness that exists within the world of the individuality. And not say that this person is not whole only when they're in a relationship with other. That's not what we're saying. In the level of the prat, every single person is whole. Every person has a whole soul, not a chatzi kader. Like Rasag writes, every person has a whole sphere. We have a complete soul, with a complete mission, a complete desire, with a certain way of thinking and feeling and being in this world. We're complete, we're whole. Therefore, we don't need to mix. Don't mix things, whether it's outside the world, in the physical phenomena of the reality, or within yourself. You're whole. That's why the mitzvah of Kilayim is spoken about in Torah, right next to the mitzvah of Hafnei Chakamaycha, like the Baal HaTurim writes. And the connection is, when you see an individual person, don't immediately associate with that person with the other person. Look at the person for who they are. It's difficult, but to see the person for who they are, not the way who you are, not as a reflection of yourself, but to actually try to able to see the other person as an individual. That's the idea of not mixing. Recognizing the wholeness that exists within the prat, within this specific. Simultaneously, the Torah is also saying, and the Mishnah is saying, that you're also a chatzi, that you're also a half, and you're in comparison to the wholeness that you receive being in a relationship, and certainly in a relationship of marriage, when you become really, you share your life in a collective way with another, in comparison to that wholeness that you receive within marriage, you are only half. So you're both whole and half simultaneously. And that's the deeper connection between Shekalim, Kilayim, the month of Adar, and the marriage. And Hashem should bless us and bless all of Kelal Yisrael, that we should be zeicha to marry off all our children, to be zeicha to have children, and to be zeicha to raise our children, Torah, l'chup l'maisen tovim, Teichar Chava, and Gesundheit. Ad Bias Geld Tzedek.